Colonel Dewey Prather started that lot at $200, and by the time he had worked his way down to $50, the crowd standing in the Galt Farm side lot had decided the whole thing was a joke. It stood at the end of the equipment row, past the hay rake and the 2 dead tractors, and it was the tallest thing on that property that was not a tree. 14 feet of timber and iron bolted together, rising up out of the broom sedge like the frame of a small barn somebody had abandoned halfway. Inside the frame hung 5 heavy vertical rods, each one as thick through as a man's wrist, each one ending in a round iron shoe. At the bottom of them sat a squat cast box about the size of a watering trough. The whole thing rested on a block of squared oak so heavy that the men who set it there had needed a team of mules and a stone sled to move it 11 miles. Every inch of it was the color of dried blood. Rust had gotten into the frame, into the shoes, into the bolt heads, into the camshaft lying across the top. Honeysuckle had climbed one leg and made a green sleeve halfway up. Somebody had wired a yellow paper tag to the frame at chest height, and the number written on it in grease pencil was 118. Lot 118, Prather said, and he did not say it with much hope. Gold mill. 5 stamps. Sells as it sits, buyer moves it. That was the 26th of October, 1974, in Lumpkin County, Georgia, on a farm 11 miles north of Dahlonega. Farrell Galt had died in August at 89, and his people were selling out the way people do in that country, in one day, in the side lot, with a flatbed trailer for a stage. 240 people had come. They had bought the mowing machine and the milk cooler and the 400 feet of woven wire and the good walnut bedstead. And now, at 3:10 in the afternoon, they had arrived at the thing nobody had ever been able to explain. Farrell Galt's father had hauled it down off Crown Mountain in the spring of 1953 with a borrowed team, telling everyone he was going to cut it up for the iron. He never cut it up. He set it in the weeds behind the corn crib and left it there, and after he died his son, left it there another 19 years. And in all that time, the only thing that mill ever did was rust and hold up honeysuckle. $50, Prather said. Somebody give me 50. Nobody moved. Then a voice went up from the middle of the crowd, from a man in a mustard-tan jacket, and it was pitched to carry. Colonel, you'd have to pay a man to take it. That was Royce Tap, who bought and sold salvage off a fenced lot on the Cleveland Highway, and who had a working opinion about the value of every object in 3 counties. The crowd laughed. Prather grinned because a grinning auctioneer is a working auctioneer, and he came back down to $25. Tap was not finished. That's 2 tons of scrap iron sitting on a block of rotten wood. And you can't get a truck within 40 foot of it, he said. And I'll tell you something else. There ain't been color in this county since Hoover. That got the biggest laugh of the day. It was also, by the standards of North Georgia in 1974, simply true. The Dahlonega Gold Belt had made the country rich in 1829 and had been giving up less and less of itself ever since. And every man in that lot had grown up hearing about the mines the way you hear about a war your grandfather was in. Dead history. Something that happened to somebody else. At the back of the crowd, near the gate, an old man in blue denim bib overalls and a straw hat gone the color of weak tea raised his hand about 8 inches off his hip. $60, Amos Ledbetter said. Prather looked at him. The crowd looked at him. And here is the part that people in that county still tell wrong. Amos did not bid $25, which is where the ask was. He bid $60, which was more than double, and he bid it in a flat voice without waiting to be asked twice, the way a man pays a bill he has been expecting for a long time. $60, Prather said. 60? Anybody? Nobody. 240 people stood in the October sun and watched a 63-year-old fuel oil driver buy 2 tons of ruin, and about half of them were smiling. Royce Tap turned all the way around to see who had done it, and when he saw who it was, he said, loud, "Amos, you need help getting that in your pocket?" The gavel came down. Amos walked up through the crowd, untwisted the baling wire, took the yellow tag off the frame, folded it once, and put it in his shirt pocket. Then he put his hand flat on the cold iron of that frame, the way you would put your hand on a horse he used to own, and he stood there a second longer than a man normally would. Ruby Ledbetter was waiting for him at the truck. She had told him that morning to bid whatever he had to bid. If you've made it this far into Amos's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Here is what Amos Ledbetter knew, standing in that lot, that nobody else standing in that lot knew. He knew that machine, not the type, that machine. From July of 1934 until the 8th of October 1942, Amos Ledbetter had been the battery man on that exact 5-stamp mill in a tin building on the side of Crown Mountain, 11 miles from where it now stood in the weeds. He had gone to work there at 19 for 20 cents an hour, and he had stayed 8 years. A stamp mill is the simplest violent machine ever built. 5 iron rods, each carrying a shoe that weighs 850 pounds, are lifted a few inches by cams on a turning shaft and dropped onto ore in a cast iron box called the mortar. 98 drops a minute, 5 stamps all day. It does not crush rock so much as beat it into wet sand. Water runs in continuously, and the sand washes out through a screen in the front of the mortar and down over a sloped copper plate coated in mercury. That is where the gold stops. Free gold touches mercury, and the mercury takes it and holds it, and the sand goes on out the tail, and the gold does not. Every so often the millman dresses the plates, scrapes the gray amalgam off with a rubber blade, squeezes it through a chamois until the loose mercury runs out, and cooks the rest in a cast iron retort until the mercury goes off as vapor and condenses back to liquid in a pipe. What is left in the bottom of the retort is a sponge the color of a winter sun. Melt that, and you have a button of gold. Amos had done that 160 times. He could still hear the battery, and he could hear that it was wrong. 5 stamps is supposed to fall in an even rolling beat, and on that mill the 4th stamp always came down a half beat late because of a worn cam nobody ever replaced. He had gone deaf in his left ear standing next to it, and he had a foreman named Bell Curry, who told him a thing in his first month that he never got loose from. Amos had swept the mill floor and started for the door with the dustpan, and Curry took it out of his hand and dumped it in the ore bin instead and said, "The mill keeps what it makes," meaning every ounce that machine ever touched is still somewhere in that building, in the floor, in the sand, in the wood, meaning you do not carry gold out the door in a dustpan just because it looks like dirt. On the 8th of October, 1942, the War Production Board issued Limitation Order L-208 and closed every gold mine in the United States as not essential to the war. The men on Crown Mountain heard about it on a Thursday. The company gave them the rest of the week to shut down clean. Amos spent that Friday doing the last plate dressing of his life. He scraped the copper down to bright metal, retorted it, and carried 61 ounces up to the office in a lard can, and then he hung his apron on the nail and went to the shipyards in Brunswick. The other half of a proper shutdown never happened. And that is the whole story, right there, in one sentence, 32 years before anybody laughed at him. A stamp battery does not sit on the ground. It sits on a mortar block, a solid mass of squared timber, oak or pine, sometimes 8 feet long and 4 feet through, buried partway in the earth and bolted to the mortar with iron straps. The block is there to take the shock. 850 pounds falling 98 times a minute will destroy anything that is not massive, and so the mill's whole life is spent hammering down into that wood. And mercury goes down with it. Every day the mortar leaks a little at the seams. Fine amalgam, gray and heavy, works into the joints and the checks and the bolt holes. And it does not wash out, and it does not evaporate, and it certainly does not walk off. It goes in, and it stays. That is why the last job at any mill that is closing for good, after the plates are dressed and the mortar is scraped, is to pull the block, cut it up, burn it, and pan the ashes. Millmen called that job the block burn, and the men who did it always said the same thing about it, which is that the block pays better than the last month of ore. On Crown Mountain, the block burn was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Amos Ledbetter had spent 32 years knowing that block had never been burned, and for most of those 32 years, the knowledge was worth exactly nothing, because the mill belonged to somebody, then to somebody else, then to a dead man, and a man does not go dig up another man's timber. Then in August of 1974, Farrell Galt died, and in October his estate was cried off a flatbed trailer in his own side lot, and lot 118 came up for sale to whoever wanted it. That is why he bid $60 when the ask was $25. He was not being foolish, he was ending the auction. Getting it home took him 9 days and cost more than 4 times what the mill cost. He hired a wrecker out of Cleveland with a boom on it and a farmer named Sherrill with a big 4-wheel drive tractor, and the two of them and Amos worked out that they could not lift it whole and could not tip it over without breaking the frame. So he took it down the way it went up. The frame came apart at the bolts, and the bolts had been in weather since Truman. So every one of them had to be heated with a torch and driven. The 5 stamp rods came out one at a time, each one 11 feet long and 400 pounds bare. The mortar itself, the cast box at the bottom, weighed 2,200 pounds empty, and they got it onto a stone sled and dragged it 40 feet to the trailer with the tractor in low gear and a snatch block on a white oak. The block came last, and the block was the reason for everything. It was buried 3 feet in the ground, and it did not want to come. They dug it out by hand with a mattock and a shovel because Amos would not let a backhoe near it. When it finally broke loose, it came up out of the hole black and wet and smelling like a cellar, and it was not rotten. Nothing that has mercury in it rots. By then, people had started driving out the Galt Road on purpose to watch. Word had gone around the square that Amos Ledbetter had bought the gold mill and lost his mind. And in a county that size, that is entertainment. Royce Tap came out on the 3rd day and stood with his hands in the pockets of the mustard-tan jacket and watched them heat bolts for 20 minutes. And before he left, he said, "Not unkindly, Amos, I'll give you 70 for the whole pile right now, and you can keep your 60. Amos said he appreciated it and kept working. He set it up behind his own smokehouse on 4 acres outside town. The iron he laid out in the grass in the order it came off. The block he set on 2 railroad ties. The mortar he left on the sled with a tarp over it. And then, for 3 weeks, Amos Ledbetter did nothing at all that looked like a plan, which is when Ruby started fielding phone calls from people who wanted to know, in a caring voice, how he was doing. What he was doing was building a retort out of a piece of 6-inch pipe, a plate steel cap, and 40 feet of copper tubing on a burned pile of fire brick behind the smokehouse, exactly the way the one on Crown Mountain had been built. He had watched a man at that mill get the shakes from breathing retort fumes in a closed room, and it had taken that man's hands away from him at 41 years old. So Amos built his outside, on the north side of the smokehouse where the wind moved all day. Then he went at the mortar and the plates, and the first thing he found was that somebody had beaten him to the copper. The plate frames under the mortar's discharge lip were empty. 4 sheets of amalgamation copper, each one 20 inches by 60, and all 4 were gone, unscrewed clean, the screw holes bright inside. He found out that evening what had happened, because in a county that size you always find out by evening. Lonnie Galt, the nephew, had pulled those plates in the summer of 1972 while cleaning up the lot, hauled them down the Cleveland Highway, and sold them across the scale to Royce Tap for $12. So there it was. The famous part, the part in every story anybody had ever heard about a gold mill, the mercury plates that catch the gold, had been sold for scrap 2 years before the auction, and the man who bought them was the same man who had stood in the side lot and gotten the biggest laugh of the day. If the story had ended there, it would have been the story everybody expected. But Amos had never once been after the plates. He knew what was on those plates, because he was the man who scraped them. He had taken them down to Bright Copper himself on a Friday afternoon in October of 1942 and turned in every ounce. There had never been anything on that copper but 32 years of weather. He was after the wood. He cut the block with a chainsaw, and he cut it the way a millman cuts a block, which is in slabs across the grain, starting at the top face where the mortar had sat. The saw threw chips that were gray-black all through, and about 4 inches down. On the third cut, a bead of quicksilver the size of a pea ran out of a check in the oak and dropped onto the toe of his boot and sat there, perfectly round, bright as a new dime. Ruby was standing in the yard. She said he did not say anything for a while. He burned the slabs in a pit lined with sheet steel, kept the fire low, and stood upwind of it, and panned the ashes in a wash tub with the hose. What came out of the bottom of that pan at the end of 2 days was a gray paste of amalgam and a fine yellow tail behind it. And then the count came in, and the count was wrong. 9 ounces. A little over 9 ounces of gold out of a block that should have carried 100. It was worth having. It was more than the mill and the moving and the tractor and the torch bottles put together, but it was not what Amos had spent 32 years knowing about. And he sat on the edge of his porch with a retort sponge in a coffee can, and could not make the arithmetic work. It was the bolt holes that told him. He went back to the block in the morning, put a tape on it, and found that the iron straps had been re-drilled. 2 sets of holes, 1 set plugged. That block was not the original. That block was a replacement, put under the mortar sometime in the mill's later years, and it had only ever taken the last few seasons of running. He got out a county map and started thinking about 1938, and about what a mining company in a poor county does with 8 feet of good squared oak it is just pulled out from under a mortar. It does not burn it in November. It burns it at the annual cleanup, and in the meantime it sells it, or gives it away, or lets a man haul it off, because to everybody except the millman it is a very large piece of used timber. Amos drove to the Galt place and asked Lonnie one question. When your granddaddy built the corn crib, where did he get the sills? Lonnie said off the mountain, from the mine, and he was proud of it. Big timbers, 12 by 12. His granddaddy always said you could not buy wood like that anymore. The corn crib had sold at the same auction as a building to be torn down and hauled off by the buyer. It had brought $30. The buyer was Royce Tap. He could have said nothing. He could have offered Tap $200 for a pile of old barn lumber and let him take the deal and be pleased with himself. And there is not a court in Georgia that would have called it anything but a trade. Amos drove out to the salvage lot on the Cleveland Highway on a Tuesday morning and told him the whole thing straight through, standing in the gravel, including the 9 ounces, including the quicksilver on his boot, including what he thought was in those 4 sills and why. Royce Tap listened to all of it. Then he said, "You're telling me the 4 sticks holding up a corn crib I paid $30 for have got gold in them?" Amos said he did not know how much. He said it could be nothing. He said the only way to find out was to burn them, and that he would do the work, and that he would split whatever came out of them down the middle. Tap took the deal, and he took it in about 4 seconds, and the reason he took it that fast is the reason people in that county still speak well of him. He said out loud, in his own gravel lot, that a man who could have lied to him for $200 and did not was a man he would rather be in business with. Those 4 seals gave up 132 ounces. It took them until the first week of December to cut, burn, pan, and retort it all, working in the cold behind the smokehouse with a fire that never got big. The last of it came out of the retort as sponge and went into a graphite crucible and came out as 3 rough buttons, and the total, everything, the block and the mortar scrapings and the sills, weighed 141 troy ounces. And then Amos Ledbetter had to sit on it, because in the autumn of 1974, an American citizen still could not legally hold gold bullion. That had been the law since 1933. What changed it was an act signed on the 14th of August 1974, and it took effect on the 31st of December that year. The man at the assay office in Gainesville told him plainly, put it in a coffee can and wait it out. So he waited 62 days with 3 gold buttons in a coffee can behind the flour bin, while the price of gold climbed all that autumn like something that had been let off a chain, and Ruby put her egg money in the same bin and said nothing about any of it to anybody. They sold it on the 14th of January, 1975, to a refiner in Atlanta at $176.50 the ounce. After the refining charge came off, the check was $24,886.50. Half of the seal gold went to Royce Tap. Amos Ledbetter's share was a little over $13,000, and $13,000 in Lumpkin County in 1975 was not money. It was a different life. He paid off the 4 acres and the truck, put a well in a bathroom in a house that had done without one since 1948, and told the fuel oil company in February that he was through driving. The county heard the number in about a week, the way it hears everything, and the sound of 240 people revising their memory of an October afternoon is a quiet sound, but you can feel it. Prather the auctioneer told people for years afterward that it was the only lot he ever sold where the buyer was the only man in the yard who could see it. Royce Tap took his share and bought the lot next to his and never once claimed he had known. What he said instead, whenever it came up, was that he had stood there in the sun and told 200 people there had not been color in that county since Hoover, and that the color had been standing 11 feet in front of him the whole time, in the weeds, with a tag on it. Amos put the mill back up. It took him a year and a half and a new block cut from a white oak off his own place. He set it behind the smokehouse where the retort had been, bolted the frame square, hung all 5 stamps, and belted the camshaft to a 5-horse electric motor, and on a Sunday afternoon in the summer of 1976, he turned it on for the first time in 34 years, with about half the county standing in his yard. The stamps came up and came down, 98 to the minute, and the sound of it went across 4 fields and came back off the ridge, and the 4th stamp still fell a half-beat late. The yellow tag from lot 118 is nailed to a post beside it under a piece of window glass, $60 in grease pencil in a hand that belonged to a man who is also gone now. Ruby was asked once, late, what she thought when he came home from that sale and told her what he had bought and what people had said to him while he was buying it. She said she never worried about it for a minute. She said Amos had been telling her the same thing about that machine since 1946, and that when a man has carried something that long, quiet, without ever once trying to prove it to anybody, you can generally take him at his word. Then she said the other thing, the thing Belle Curry had said to a 19-year-old boy in a tin building on the side of Crown Mountain in 1934, and which turned out to be true in a way that even Belle Curry had not meant it. The mill keeps what it makes.